Welcome, everyone. Hello.
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 Hello. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. So many faces.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this week's edition of Distant Not Disengaged, where the title for this week is Missed Connections, Social Cohesion and COVID-19, and we are so glad that you are here to join us. So as we get settled, I invite you to please put yourselves on mute after those wonderful hellos, thank you, as well as change your full, your name on your little picture there to your full name and your preferred pronouns. This is part of our practice at Distant Not Disengaged to ensure that we're being accountable to each other and to agreement to sort of engage respectfully. There should be some notes in the chat box there about how to change your name. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. We are meant to have closed captioning today. I'm going to stand by, and Seth, you're going to let me know when and if that happens, and we will give you instructions at that point about how to access the closed captioning, and we apologize. There may be a little missed connection here, speaking of missed connections, with our closed captioning team AI Media to be here. And we'll come back and give you more details of that when and if they hopefully join today's session. We have tech help here to help you. So you'll see some names in there that say Seth, Arnav, Max, tech help or tech host. If you have any questions that you need help with technically, just feel free to send them a direct message in the chat and they'll be able to help you work through that. So I'd like to formally begin today by acknowledging that I personally am coming to you today as an uninvited guest from the unceded territory of the Hukamelam and Squamish Snetchum speaking people. We invite you to become familiar with the rightful stewards of the land where you are. We've put up a great resource here, which is www.whose.land. Help you identify the Indigenous territories you're on. Another great resource is native-land.ca, where you can learn more about Indigenous territory, language, and treaties of Indigenous people all over the world. So as we move into today's event, we'll be talking about social cohesion. And as we are thinking about that, it's important for us to reflect on how historically groups of people have been left out and pushed out of our societies. They've been unwelcomed and uninvited. And we find ourselves now in a time where we've been provided with more than enough information about this, about the injustices and the inequalities. And we're in a pandemic that demands that we must hold ourselves and our systems accountable as we move forward to ensure that we are better and we do better. There's no excuse to continue to repeat the mistakes of our past. So we'd like you to introduce yourselves to everyone else in the chat box. So please provide your name, your preferred pronouns, and define yourself in relationship to someone you have connected with during COVID that you might not have pre-COVID. And so we want you to define yourself as in relationship to that person. So for me, I'm Janet Weber, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a downstairs neighbor I live in a vertical building. I now know my upstairs neighbor who I would not have met had it not been for COVID-19. So please say, let's get to meet each other in the chat. And let's get started. So Distant Not Disengaged is an experimental, interactive, online community co-learning series that we launched in response to COVID-19 and the need to stay connected even as we physically distance from each other. The series is a collaboration between SFU Public Square, City Hive, SFU Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue. We've run events pretty much most Thursdays since April. We had a little hiatus in June. This is week number 14, and this is also our last weekly event before we switch to a monthly format in the fall. If you're tweeting or Instagramming, the hashtag is Distant Not Disengaged. You can see our social handles there on the slide. And this week we're thrilled to have Cause and Effect as our event partner, and you'll meet our co-facilitator Jane Cox again in a moment. So last couple pieces of housekeeping, you all received our community guidelines as part of your registration. They're here on the slide. You would have gotten them in your reminder emails. That's, this is why we ask you to provide your full name and review our community guidelines ahead of the event. We do this to ensure the safety of our guests and each other as we want to foster an honest and accountable dialogue. Thank you for respecting our community guidelines and fellow guests. Really quickly, zero tolerance for any sort of violence against others. If there's any harm that's incited, those participants will be removed. Please try to be as present as possible. Turn on your video during the breakouts in particular if you're comfortable. Put your phone away, mute your tabs, focus and be here with us. Thoughtful questions are welcome throughout the session. If your question is for a particular speaker, please type at their name at the beginning of your question, and we will be taking questions through the chat. So please, and we're gathering, so please, as we go through this presentations today, put your questions in the chat. And don't assume pronouns or gender or knowledge based on someone's name. Please use the pronouns that people include and their usernames that they have included on their video. Step up, step back. So if you've asked a lot of questions or shared a lot of comments, ensure that we can make space for everyone's voices to be included today. And practice self-care always. If you need to get up, take a break, if you need to turn off your video, whatever it is that you need to do, we invite you to do that. We are recording today's session, but no one other than the actual speakers and probably myself and Jane's videos will be included in our post-event video. Anything that happens in the breakout rooms, any of your names and your photos or pictures will not be included in the video, so your privacy or keeping your privacy will be maintained there. How today's going to go is we're going to, right after this, meet Jane and then go into some breakout rooms to just get to know one another. This is your chance when you're going to be able to show the photo that we've asked you to bring, and if you don't have a photo, that's fine. You can just speak to something. Then we'll come back from the breakouts. We will meet and hear from our special guests who will be joining folks in breakout rooms, and then we will take your questions for our speakers. And then we're done. So I'm pleased to introduce now Jane Cox, who is the principal of Cause and Effect, a brand and communications consultancy who have supported some of the most super innovative companies and campaigns that have happened around Vancouver and beyond. Jane is going to speak a bit more about the context for today and get us ready to go into our breakout rooms.
Thank you, Janet. I'm excited to be here today, and I'm tuning in from the unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish people, and I'm looking forward to listening to the diverse perspectives of our panelists. Social cohesion is relevant to my work as a design and communication strategist because human perceptions and behaviors are the key levers we work with when problem solving and designing new experiences to connect and engage diverse groups. However, what surfaces for me when I reflect on our society's connectedness these past months is something much more personally felt, and I'm sure you all can relate. Because social cohesion is not only about the relationships among members within and across communities, it's also about the feeling of belonging to that community. Since March, we've all experienced unsettling news stories to witnessing angry outbursts from strangers on the streets if someone stands too close. There's been homeschooling stress and continued injustice stemming from racism. Even on a daily basis, there is a loss of connection. We can't greet friends with hugs or give or receive smiles walking down the street because they're hidden behind our masks. I acknowledge my privilege, but I'm sure we're all experiencing a collective nervousness and sadness as people lose loved ones, their jobs, and struggle with our new reality. But like all key moments in history, there is this awesome mix of challenge and opportunity, and the human spirit often shines brightest in moments of crises. The enthusiastic participation of the 7 p.m. cheer is but one of those moments I can think of, and it's still having lasting positive effects in my neighborhood alone. And just last week, you may have read the anthropologist Wade Davis's article in Rolling Stones went viral. And although it was called The Unraveling of America, we're not so dissimilar. And I'd like to share a short quote as it seems to touch on a core issue relevant to our topic. He said, more than any other country, the United States in the post-war era lionized the individual at the expense of community and family. It was the sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. What was gained in terms of mobility and personal freedom came at the expense of common purpose. He then goes on to point out elements that can enforce social solidarity, even with great divides: faith, strength and comfort of family, pride of tradition, and a connection to the land and spirit of place. And I noticed that Seth's put a link to that article if you want to read further. It's quite interesting. So on that note, I want you to thank you all for joining us here today, because that in itself is an act of connection. And so you're familiar now with the term about social cohesion, and I want to have you move now to your breakout rooms, and like Janet said, you'll have facilitators there to support a conversation. So just introduce yourself, share the photo. If you don't have one, you can add some comments into the chat, and there will be a couple of questions that your facilitators will help you respond to. So we'll be there for about 18-20 minutes, and Seth will move us swiftly over to the breakout rooms now. See you there.
Jane, I think we're over to you.
Okay, we're all back in? Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We had a fun little chat in our group. I hope you guys did too, and you got to know each other a little bit better. We're going to ask you now to please turn off your video so that we can highlight our guest speakers today. So mute your sound and your video. Directions for how to do that will be in the chat box. Please share in the chat any interesting initiatives, organizations, campaigns, approaches, etc. for staying connected that we've discussed in the breakout or that you are aware of. We will not be reading long bios today, but they are linked in the event promotion, and we will drop them also into the chat box for you. Please drop your questions into the chat, as that's how we like to be taking questions today. So if you want to direct a question to a particular speaker, please @ their name into the chat box and we'll collect those for you. And now I'd like to hand it over to Janet to introduce our first speaker.
Gotta find my unmute button. Thank you, Jane. All right, so we are gonna get going. So first we have Dr. Sean Lauer, who is an associate professor of sociology at UBC and is currently examining community-based organizations in Vancouver as a form of social infrastructure. Over to you, Dr. Lauer.
Thanks, you can call me Sean, that's nice. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. And I just want to say quickly how much I enjoyed listening to people share their stories, experiences in the breakout room. It's really nice just to be able to be part of this. So when Janet asked me to participate, I thought I would just kind of give a broad sort of sense of why I find this question compelling and interesting, and a little bit about the kind of research and work I do related to that, and what I'm thinking about COVID-19 as well. So, it's interesting to me, because at the beginning we were calling this social distancing, and to me that really is related to an ongoing question within sociology. We sometimes call it the community question or the community problem in sociology. And that's really this idea that that in the world we live in today, there is a certain amount of social distance that we're dealing with and we're confronted with in day-to-day life. So if you were to kind of think for a minute about the kinds of encounters you have on a regular basis, it's actually notable and surprising how many of them are with strangers, people we don't know already and people we might not ever meet again. And there's kind of a paradox about that, about being around people but not knowing them, and not really being engaged with them all the time. And it's a similar thing if you think about our neighborhoods oftentimes. And in our neighborhoods, we're often living quite close. There's a lot of people living quite close to each other. But oftentimes we don't have really strong connections or know those people very well. And it's sort of paradoxical to be surrounded by people. I myself live in an apartment building, and so there's hundreds of people near me, and I know a very small minority of them. Those kind of conditions can lead to this kind of feeling of being a little bit more reserved, kind of separate from people around us, but also contribute to things like loneliness, the experience of loneliness, and that sort of thing. And as sociologists, a lot of times we pay attention to what are the problems that follow from those kinds of problems, the kind of community problem. But we also sometimes think about what the antidotes are. And I do a little bit about that myself. And particularly lately, I'm thinking of it in terms of this concept of social infrastructure, which refers to the physical places spaces in our neighborhoods that bring us together, bring people together into interaction of some kind. So I'm thinking particularly about things like public spaces, so parks and sidewalks and the seawall and other kinds of paths like that, but also commercial establishments, places like cafes and restaurants and bars and other kinds of places where we can go in and interact with people. And but I'm also thinking about community organizations too. So places like libraries and churches and community centers that bring people together around interaction. I myself, I do research on neighborhood houses in Vancouver in particular. So those are the particular types of community organizations. I've been just wrapping up a project. And then in that project, my colleagues and I have interviewed dozens of people who are participants or staff members or otherwise other people involved in neighborhood houses. We've done survey research with hundreds of people, learning more about their experience of work being part of neighborhood houses. We've done a lot of archival work about the history of those neighborhood houses in Metro Vancouver as well. And a lot of that kind of research is really informing the way I think about this kind of idea of social cohesion. So the interesting thing about social infrastructure is it's an opportunity for us to kind of maintain existing relationships. So people that we already have ties with, these are places where we can maintain those ties, but they're also equally important for places where we can establish new kinds of connections with people around us. And that's really significant given that kind of the confrontation with strangers that I was mentioning earlier, that the encounters with strangers we're having all the time. These are places where we can kind of meet new people, establish relationships, and form ties and build social cohesion. The mechanism by which that happens is in these social infrastructure places is through routine interaction. So I myself there's a cafe outside my house that I go to somewhat regularly, and going there regularly, I start to meet people and get to know people. And if I drink my coffee in the park out front, I get to recognize people who are in the area who are also doing something similar, passing through that park. And over time, we can start to recognize each other and start to maybe those kind of stranger relationships can decrease a little bit. For my interest in community organizations, I'm particularly interested in the role that community organizations are different because of the different kinds of programming. They actually provide a kind of shared focus for people that bring people together into interaction around a certain activity that they work on together. And it's that kind of routine interaction over time with a shared focus that can really develop new relationships. And I find that to be kind of really important when I think about these ideas of social cohesion. So obviously the question is, over the past 6 months or more now, we've had a real constraint on our ability to use social infrastructure. And for a long time, it's been really shut down on us. But right now, there's a little bit of opening, but it's still being used under constrained situations. That's particularly true for community organizations, where we're using our parks, we're somewhat using our commercial establishments, but community organizations in particular have been shut down, and it's really a threat to these kinds of interactions. So, I mean, for me, what's really interesting, we did it in the breakout room a little bit, but I hope we get to talk a little bit more about it, is what are the kind of consequences of losing this kind of social infrastructure. But I'm really kind of fascinated, and I've learned a lot already about the kind of ways that we're adapting under these kind of constraints of our use of social infrastructure. So I hope we get to talk a little bit more about that in the remainder of our time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, there were a lot of interesting things that I'm sure we can share afterwards. I'm going to introduce the next speaker now, Jan Kestens, Professor, Department of Social and Preventative Medicine at the University of Montreal. I have translated that to English. And he has recently launched a Cohesion study, and he has some slides that he will share with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jen. I don't know if you can see my slides already on the screen with the title slide. Yes, all right. So thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'm a professor at Université de Montréal, School of Public Health. And my work is mostly on urban environments and health, looking at how cities are being transformed and how these transformations create health or create health inequities. And so with the COVID situation in March, we started shifting our research program a little bit and have launched since then the Cohesion study. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So COVID Cohesion stands here for COVID-19 Health and Social Interaction in Neighborhoods. And this study has been launched with my colleagues, Kate Zinzer and Gregory Mulek, and other collaborators across the country. So what is Cohesion? Cohesion is actually a pan-Canadian cohort study that collects data in real time to evaluate the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on social determinants of health, health outcomes, and related inequities. We have a pretty large vision and ambition about documenting the impacts of this pandemic through time. How are we doing this? We have actually set up an infrastructure that allows participants, and here we are talking about all Canadians aged 15 and up, who can log online and participate to this study. The way to participate is to sort of two options. One is to fill online questionnaires, and so we have a series of questions around health, mobility, perceptions, and so on. And participants can also download a smartphone app where we passively collect mobility data, physical activity data, as well as momentary assessment of well-being, for example. And all this data is then stored on a secured Compute Canada server database, where it's then being analyzed. And the idea with all this is to provide evidence and support decision-making for public health authorities, but also for cities and urban planners. So we just launched this study last month in June, 2 months. So what is this study about? We are looking at attitudes and practices related to COVID-19. We are looking at daily mobility and changes in social activity. We are very interested in mental health outcomes, social isolation and stigma. We're also collecting data on socio-demographics, but also food and health insecurity, household composition, and living conditions. So we're trying to get a pretty large portrait, and there is a baseline questionnaire, and then every 2 weeks we have these follow-up questionnaires, shorter follow-up questionnaires with sometimes specific themes. So for example, we are preparing a follow-up now on back to school day to better understand perceptions towards this event. Another originality of Cohesion, if I can say, is that we are very interested in the spatial and social dimensions of people's lives. And so we are using a questionnaire, a map-based questionnaire. People can answer about where they go, the activity places they go to with an interactive Google Map application. And they also provide information with whom they go to these locations. So as we document the activity spaces, we also document people's in-person social interactions. And we can then link these two information together and do a number of analyses and possibly link this data, for example, to mental health outcomes. So the smartphone app, which is an optional participation, allows us to monitor more objectively mobility through GPS data collection, but also social contacts with Bluetooth information. And we also have these little questionnaires that ask about affect, daily variations in affect, in terms of well-being, but also in terms of social interactions or sleep quality, for example. So all this data, what is it for? It's really to monitor trends around all these themes over time and across space. Also, we believe that there will be, of course, a lot of variation depending on where people live, on their conditions. And then we can do a number of inferential analyses to really estimate the impact of COVID-19 and the health determinants, the conditions in which people live on health through different methods that I've listed here. One of the outputs also we are working on is to build an interactive visualization platform so that all this data becomes readily accessible for decision makers, for communities, and that this data can then serve the discussion and implementation of new solutions. This is really a pan-Canadian effort, and I want to underline and thank our network of partners. We have been partnering with a number of health authorities across the country. We have support from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And of course, we have colleagues across the country also that working with. I see a little panel that says time. That's probably, I should wrap up here. maybe I'm going to show a little bit of some some findings, very preliminary, but just to show you here, for example, in green, those who have mentioned that they all do all the time or often adopt the following measures. And if you look at practicing physical distancing, you see that we have really a large majority of people who either all the time or often practice physical distancing. If I go a little further, in terms of concerns, currently, how concerned are you about the following? We see that there is large levels of concerns, high levels of concerns, especially, for example, here in terms of the pandemic's impact on your community. Here we have around 75% of people who are concerned or very concerned, and then, of course, concerns in relation to senior as well as children. One interesting thing in the baseline data, we are asking prior to COVID-19, how often did you feel, for example, that you lacked companionship or that you were left out or isolated from others? And that will be, of course, of interest to see as the crisis evolves how these numbers change. But we see that already we have a significant number of people who either often, but also some of the time, feel that they lack companionship or are left out. And finally, just to illustrate the data on the in-person interaction, here is a question that illustrates how often people in the last 7 days, how many people in their network they have met in person in the last 7 days. So we can be able to track all this information and provide interesting insights to the situation in the months to come. And I'm stopping with a few seconds late, probably, sorry for that. But probably we'll have more time to discuss that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really nice segue here into Lidia, because I mean, obviously one of the big standouts there was the percentage of people that already felt isolated pre-COVID. I mean, that's really the bigger issue. And then how is that going to worsen, or will it worsen through COVID? We have a couple little questions, but we'll get to them. Just there's curious about the aggregation, how the data is being decided, and is the app in languages other than English, but maybe we'll get to that when we get into the questions. So I am now going to welcome Lidia Kemeny, who is Vancouver Foundation's Director of Partnerships. She oversees the Neighbourhood Small Grants initiative and leads the Foundation's community research agenda, which examines community life in Metro Vancouver and across BC. Over to you, Lidia. Muted. You're still muted.
Sorry. So yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. Now, for those of you who don't know about Vancouver Foundation, despite our name, we are an organization that works across the entire province. And the way that we work is that we connect the generosity of donors with the energy, ideas, and time of people to create healthy, vibrant, and livable communities across BC. So for over 78 years, we have distributed more than $1 billion to the charitable sector across British Columbia. And the way that we do this work is through hundreds of volunteers and partners across the province, including more than 50 community foundations across BC. So we couldn't do this work without these partners. And so in a way, you could say that connections are our life force at Vancouver Foundation. So what I want you to do now is just think of a time when you felt really happy and satisfied and joyful. And just think about that experience for you. And for most of us, if you remember a memory and it comes easily to you, for most of us, that situation is going to involve being and engaging with people. So for most of us, happy memories involve being with others. So we know that meaningful connections play a very integral role in our well-being. And what we see now is how challenged we are, probably more than ever. We may see and meet other people, but the important thing is, how do we connect? Do I get you? Do you get me? Do you trust me enough to let your guard down, to let me in? The more people we have with whom we can talk about personal matters, the more satisfied we tend to be in our own life. So loneliness is bad for happiness. And over the years, we have heard hundreds of stories in our work at Vancouver Foundation of what happens when people do connect to each other. And so I think about some of the stories that come out of Neighbourhood Small Grants when people feel disconnected and lonely and are despairing about that loneliness and reach out to others to organize a small project or to invite people into conversation, and how that changes their life, the life of those around them. And so this is how grassroots action works. And there are thousands of people across the province already working at this level. And at Vancouver Foundation, we have such a commitment and a belief to supporting the grassroots movement. So we know that now more than ever, we need to encourage each other to take action, no matter how small. We have seen through COVID a certain paralysis in many people, even in those people who generally are community activists. And this is a normal reaction to disaster. And I think Maya Angelou once had this great quote where she said, all of us at some time or another need help. Whether we are giving or receiving help, each of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us to our neighbors. In our own way, each one of us is a giver and a receiver. So why is this issue of social connections so important? So for over a decade, Vancouver Foundation has been committed to learning and understanding this. And we do this because we know that when people feel disconnected, they give less, they serve less, they participate less, they care less, and they experience poorer health outcomes, including lower immunity. So what we know is that before COVID, people were already mentioning that they were experiencing sort of unsatisfying relationships, feeling like they had nothing to offer and retreating from community life. And these experiences have physiological, psychological, and social effects which impact our health, our resilience, and community well-being. And then came COVID. And we've already had research that shows us that the majority of Canadians feel that physical distancing has left them feeling more lonely and more isolated, and that this tends to be more pronounced the younger you are. In BC, specifically, people are feeling more worried, more stressed, more bored, more anxious, and lonely than before the pandemic. So COVID attacks our bodies, but also the cultural foundations of our lives. So what we need are new tools, capacities, and commitments. Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And so the question is, what will it take for us to become the helpers and to ask for help? Among the most basic tools are continuing to host conversations, whether they are physically distant or virtual. And there are increasing numbers of people who are stepping up to do this. And so this is an area for us at Vancouver Foundation that we are really challenging everyone to become involved in. We have work to do if we want to improve our chances of being resilient post-COVID. Now more than ever, it's critical to our and our community's well-being. The question that to hold is to how do we each individually and collectively inspire conversations? Please check out our On the Table event in September, where we've created a platform to make it easy for people to do this. And what we're really hoping is that you know, as we move into the fall and the winter, which is traditionally a harder time for people, that we can create new and more opportunities for us and for people to come to connect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was, speaks to us all as individuals in the community. And I noticed someone in the chat asked, is this data available? And I'm sure we could provide links because the Vancouver Foundation has done a lot of research on this topic pre-COVID, and it's still relevant. We're hearing it's more relevant than ever. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Carmel Tanaka. She's a community engagement professional whom is guided by the Jewish concept of Tikkun Olam, which means the repairing of the world. Her professional specialties are organizational disaster management and partnership building. However, if you listen to her talk this morning on the radio, much of her work to bring people together is volunteer. Very important work. Thanks, Carmel, for being here.
Thank you much. Thank you very much for having me. It's Tikkun Olam, and it definitely does guide the work that I do. So I'm going to switch gears here and share with people tuning in what it's like to be a community engagement professional on the ground during COVID. A lot of my events that I used to organize were in person in the city and now have had to go online. We've all had to pivot. We've all had to figure out how to get through this global pandemic as individuals and then as organizations. And so we had to pivot very quickly. I think overnight, a lot of people are saying we've had to become video content producers, graphic designers, how are we gonna get people to attend online events? And that's for those who have the access to the internet. So that is quite a privilege to be able to access the internet. And so for those who have, I've been able to create events that have been, I think, quite interesting. I wear a number of hats. One of my hats is JQT Vancouver, the local Jewish queer trans group of Vancouver. And what we've done to connect individuals, especially intergenerational people, is having an oral history project where we interview aging priders in the LGBTQ Jewish community. And so we have younger JQTs interviewing older LGBTQ Jews. We went forward and created a Jewish Queer Trans Heritage Month. And normally LGBTQ Jews are underrepresented in mainstream Jewish community, especially when it comes to celebrations. So we made sure that we were showcasing poetry, music, drag, and hip hop from Jewish queer and trans artists. But what I wanted to say before I go into the other hats that I wear is that I really hope that it's clear now that community grassroots initiatives which focus on bringing people together in community are essential to our sanity. And if it wasn't known before COVID, I hope it is now. Another hat that I wear is my role at Indian Summer Festival. And that really is the bread and butter that I'm able to put a roof over my head and put food on the table with. Everything else that I do, including the cross-cultural walking tours, which brings together various different tour guides to talk about Vancouver's oldest neighborhood, Strathcona. So we're bringing together the Jewish community, the Black community for Hogan's Alley, Chinatown, Powell Street area, and the downtown East Side. We had to reimagine what our event would look like for the month of May, so we went online. And that really helped. We went from 17 partner organizations last year for our in-person walking tours to 30 participating partner organizations this year. So there definitely is not only a desire to bring individuals together, but also organizations and communities. But we're also seeing the rise in racism, and there are a lot of crises happening. I'm visibly Asian, and there are many attacks that are happening in oh, thank you, Seth. Got 2 minutes left. And so I've been involved in the Vancouver Asian Film Festival's Eliminate Hate campaign in partnership with Project 1907 in order to produce a safe reporting environment for Asian Canadians to, share their experiences of what's happening, because there's some pretty disturbing statistics that are coming out of that. And yes, 90% of the work that I do is volunteer. Many of the organizations that are the groups, rather, because they're not really organizations that I bring together, don't fit the mold for budgets, for government funding, for mainstream granting institutions. And so that I've been not only invited to speak today to talk about the volunteer work that I do for communities outside of the communities themselves, but also to go on to CBC Radio, which was my first national or at least regional radio bit ever, to really draw attention to the fact that we need more funding opportunities to support community engagement professionals like myself that are not backed by one particular organization, so that our less conventional community initiatives in the arts and cultural sector are helping people connect, are able to do so. And, it's no secret, Vancouver is a socially cold place. So my encouragement to everyone is to create the spaces that you want to be a part of. And, back after that, I created a group just the other day, 4 months ago, with Jewpanese people from all around the world, people who look like me, who are part of families like me, and you know, you can do it too. Thank you for tuning in.
Who's going? Jane, you, me?
Oh, thought it was you, but
Okay.
thanks, Carmel. That was awesome. But yeah, Janet, go ahead.
We're co-facilitating on the fly here. Okay, those
Yes.
were all like such great presentations. Thank you. We have a couple of questions. I've got a million questions, but we've got a couple of questions that I just want to make sure that we respond to that have come from the audience. Also, please feel free to put your stuff in the chat. So Yan, we've got a couple of questions here about the data and how it's being separated. So demographics, youth, children, etc. And I think Renee asked that question. So if you don't, we can get Renee to add more if that wasn't enough. And also we've got a question I think was from Luna. Is the data tracking app available in multiple languages, e.g. Other than English?
Yes, so yeah, and the data, of course, the idea is to do cross analyses, for example, by groups or by location, or depending on your neighborhood conditions. So and it all depends on the power of the cohort and so the number of participants. The more we want to divide things into groups, the more participants we need. So this is really one of the constraints that we have. And it also raises the issue of representativity, you know, who is participating in these types of studies. And so we are really looking to work in close relationship with local community organizations to have the best reach towards all community groups and to be the most inclusive, so that we can tell a more diverse story with our data. The app itself is currently either in French or in English. It's bilingual, and we are planning possibly to translate in other languages again to include a more diverse sample.
Hey, thank you. And then we've got a question who I believe was from Richard, and I think a few different of you folks could maybe respond to this. And you know, and thinking about you know, Carmel made the point around right now the only people that can participate in a lot of the things that we talked about are those that have the privilege and the access to be able to be online. How can people respond to your questions, Jan, if they can't get online? So Richard asks, what about people that have addiction issues and that are homeless? I myself am a recovering addict. So when he sees his counselor, he calls her on the phone, or he goes to see her and wears a mask. So being homeless is lonely enough, never mind not having a place to live. So I think, you know, as we're thinking about diversity of data, as we're thinking about social cohesion and how we need to do better, you know, does anyone on the panel maybe want to speak to how we can start ensuring that we are reaching different populations and generally more marginalized populations that are left out of a lot of these conversations? Anyone?
Maybe I could just, if it's okay if I jump in. You know, I don't know if I can do justice to the very specific aspects of the question, but I think, you know, I was interested in social infrastructure, and I think one thing we always have to think about with things like social infrastructure is access, really, right? And there's always sort of formal and informal rules about access to these things, to these kinds of places that I think are kind of essential to building social cohesion. And so there's going to be access to the spaces that exist, but there's also going to be sort of a variable distribution of those spaces across cities and regions as well. And so I think kind of paying attention to all that stuff is really important. And I think with homelessness, for instance, like there are kind of formal rules about, you know, being allowed, say, to have tents in certain places and all those kinds of things. So there's really kind of important issues, I think, about that we have to be really aware of. But there's also sort of the informal kind of rules about who's sort of welcome in different kinds of places. And this translates, I think, up to to community organizations and things like neighborhood houses that I study too, because I often think about these places, about the diversity of people who are welcomed in these different kinds of places, and because that has important impacts for the kinds of people we interact with, the kinds of people we have experiences with, and it can kind of change the way we maybe understand our sense of belonging based on those kinds of interactions we have too. So a little, anyway, hopefully I'm in the neighborhood of the spirit of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Also jump in as someone who has, you know, spent numerous years trying to amplify voices of marginalized people in various different communities. It's about representation, it's about getting the word out, and it's also about having genuine relationships and trust. You can't just, you know, go in and bring attention to a very important issue if you are not a welcomed member of that community. And so a lot of work needs to go helping, especially BIPOC communities. You know, the walking tours that that go through Strathcona. You know, I asked each of the organizations who do existing walking tours. I said, hey, what do you do when you get to Oppenheimer Park? You know, do you address what's going on here? And a lot of organizations didn't, because they, one, didn't feel comfortable talking about it. They're not experts on the area. They didn't want to draw attention to it. They'll pick different routes around it. And on my walking tour, that's unacceptable. I want to make sure that if we are walking through the living rooms of people, we're going to make sure that we are going to address the reasons, the historical reasons why this park is the way it is, and why there's a housing crisis, why there's a fentanyl crisis. You know, there's other ways that you can bring attention to it, and we all have the power to do so. It's our responsibility.
Just one other piece that I would add as well is, you know, I think for many people who end up with homelessness and addiction issues, at the core of that journey for many people is a tremendous lack of belonging that may have in part led to some of those challenges and issues. And so, you know, I think we also have to really challenge our own capacity and ability to think of those solutions given our own positions and privilege, and find, you know, new ways of entering into relationship. And, you know, as I think has been said, you know, I don't think that there's, you know, an easy solution to this. I think it has to do with renegotiating our own discomfort and our own understanding of how we are and how we show up in community, who gets invited in, under what terms, and how to build our own capacity to you know, be at ease with our own discomfort. And, you know, until we find ways of doing that, I really think that it's going to be a challenge for us to find, you know, real long-term solutions towards equity and towards understanding who we can invite into these circles. So, you know, I think doing lip service is definitely not going to solve this problem. And I think we all have a lot of work to do. And in many ways, COVID feels like a great time for us to actually, you know, roll up our sleeves and have some of those conversations, because at the root, this issue about social isolation and connections has a very important part that is embedded in this challenge and issue.
Thank you for that, all of you. I'm just gonna, there's a quick follow-up here, Lydia. So someone asks, I'm sorry, I don't know who it was, curious if Vancouver Foundation has research on the effects of income inequality on the roots of disconnection and resultant health and social impacts. Do you dig into economic inequality in your research?
We haven't up to now. That has not been an area that we have really looked at, although there are certainly others that have, and we reference some of that research. But as in terms of our, you know, it's one of the things that we look at when we collect demographic data, and we look to see how that influences people's sense of belonging. But we haven't looked at that specifically as a body of research or investigation up to now.
Yan, do you look at, is sort of those sort of socioeconomic variables included in your study?
Sure. I mean, what we believe is that this crisis is revealing in a certain way the extent of socioeconomic inequities, not only in terms of income and education, but also in terms of contextual living conditions that are which roles are being reinforced. And it's certainly at a time where it's an opportunity to discuss these inequities and to, in a certain way, reinvent the city also, and reinvent our neighborhoods so that they become more inclusive spaces. And this goes through transformations of our public spaces, and how our public spaces are accessible or accepting diversity and welcoming people and favoring connections. It's all a challenge, of course, in the context of physical distancing, but it's maybe even more important probably in that context to provide, you know, public spaces that allow us to be together.
Well, you're muted, Jane.
Am I muted? Oh, sorry. Yeah. I see an interesting question that came up in the chat here. It is for all panelists, and it's from Luna. And a big part of our community culture is policing, and not just by the police, but by rules, policies, practices that are segregative. Indigenous, Black, and people of color are disproportionately. How do we recreate communities that are not always surveilling each other?
Working together, collaborating together, fact checking one another on the walking tours as another example. We were talking about the origins of Chinatown, and some people were saying, well, actually it wasn't at this cross street, and it was actually here. But for some reason, the city has created an exhibit to say that the starting point was here. And so I think it's really important is to simply get to know one another. A lot of the groups that are participating on the walking tours have never worked together before with one another. And since then, so this is last May, I've been seeing different partnerships happening throughout the year. And for me, this gives me a lot of joy. We call that nachas in Hebrew, so that you can, you know, see the fruits of your labor. All I wanted were for these people to get a chance to get to know one another. That's all it takes. Get to know your neighbor.
Sean?
Maybe if you don't mind me just seconding what Carmel's saying, and saying that I find it to be really important. And when I'm thinking in my own work, when I'm thinking about social infrastructure, I'm thinking of this idea of, I'm calling it cosmopolitan social infrastructure, but just the idea of places that bring diversity together and are open to bringing diverse people together. And I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it, but I do think that there is something to those kinds of having those experiences of interacting, getting to know people, spending time working on projects together that actually leads to a greater understanding of ourselves, of the people we're interacting with, but also an openness beyond that. And this is a bit, you know, like I said, it's aspirational a bit for me too, but you can actually see this kind of stuff happen in research as well, though.
Does Jan or Lydia, do you want to respond? We are in our last minute here. I can't believe how quickly these sessions go. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, the history of city is in part based on segregation practices, you know, and it's time to change these practices and think again. So that's for sure. It's not a new story, but it's a story we should rewrite for the future, if I can say.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that as well is, in many ways, I think if not now, when?
What's the second part of that? If not,
if
you
not now,
who?
When? Yeah, and who? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We still have some more questions. We will try to get these questions collected and maybe see if we can get a couple of answers offline from some of our panelists. Apologies that we didn't get to everything. An hour and 15 minutes is way too short. But what I heard from everyone is it's about relationship and being in relationship and how key that is to everything that we need to be thinking about in terms of social cohesion. Maybe Jane, do you want to talk to us a little bit about an opportunity that you and Lydia are involved with?
Sure. Well, it actually just is a nice segue from what Carmel mentioned about create the communities you want to be part of. And there's two interesting, if you have energy and were inspired by the conversation today or any other topic, you can take part in these two opportunities, which are brought to you by the Vancouver Foundation. But I've worked with them on the first one, which is called On the Table. It's basically a community platform. It's in its third year, and it invites individuals all across BC, all across the province, to host your own event. So it's as simple as that. You sign up, like we heard today, just inviting others to share conversation is the first step to community. And so it's an easy platform. You sign up to host. And that's it. And this year, Vancouver Foundation is also granting up to $100 to support the event, your event needs. So that could be refreshments for your group. It might be a Zoom license if you need access to online meeting. And then if you're inspired from that conversation and an idea emerges, you know, maybe you want to bring it to life. And so the second initiative that's, I think, Lydia, it's 25th year anniversary. It's been going on for a long time across BC. And you can start your own community building project. So it's called Neighbourhood Small Grants. And there's a grant of up to $500 for individuals to bring that idea to life. So both these initiatives are very much around bringing people together and creating that social cohesion we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you to our special guest speakers. Thank you to Jane for co-facilitating with me today. Thank you to all of the many staff that are behind the scenes. It's incredible how much more work it takes to do an online event and to do it technically well than sometimes it does in person. And of course, thank you to all of the participants and your amazing questions today. We're on hiatus until September, but we're back. I think it's the third Thursday of September. I can't remember the exact day. We're going to be sharing out these videos. We welcome feedback. We welcome more questions. And we're going to formally end the event here, but we're going to keep the Zoom open for just a little while longer. If you want to hang out and just sort of have informal conversation with each other and with any of our panelists that are able to stay, no pressure. I know everybody's busy. And that's that. Be safe, be well over these remaining weeks of summer and into the fall.